It's really amazing to be here. It should really be Julian here. Most of you will know that Julian is in a high-security prison, and he's been there since the 11th of April 2019. And in fact, he's been in solitary confinement since Saturday when he tested positive for COVID. I was thinking about how to talk about freeing Julian here. And Julian told me, he explained Bitcoin to me back in 2011. And I come from a completely different kind of area. I did law and politics, and it was all a bit alien to me. So he explained the technology behind it. But he also gave me a big picture understanding of the significance of Bitcoin. And I'll go into the two things that he said about Bitcoin, which kind of give you that big picture understanding. But I think it is also a pathway to understanding the kind of parallel tracks of WikiLeaks and Bitcoin, and the future of Bitcoin and how that's tied to what's being done to Julian. So the first thing that Julian has said about Bitcoin is that Bitcoin breaks Orwell's dictum. He who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future. Bitcoin technology, rather. And that in that sense, Bitcoin and the Bitcoin technology are trying to fight censorship in a very similar way to the way WikiLeaks has fought censorship using cryptography. As you know, Julian started WikiLeaks with incredible innovation. He was an incredible pioneer that has changed the way journalism is done. And he did that because Julian, of course, he was a cypherpunk, he's a cryptographer, and he understood that the major newsrooms had no idea about how to protect their sources when they were operating on the internet. They just had no idea that, a source would just email them, and then, of course, that's the one and only time they would be able to be their source, because they would be able to be tracked. So Julian introduced the Dropbox to anonymize sources. And that's why WikiLeaks was able to get such high-quality sources, because it was able to guarantee anonymity. And then, of course, the two other innovations, the scale of publication and the idea that publications should be able to be made at scale, and archives bring a incredible added value to the way journalism can be done. He introduced the idea of scientific journalism. The second thing that Julian has said about Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is the real Occupy Wall Street. Now, the reference might be lost on some of you because some of you are quite young. But Occupy Wall Street came about in 2011. And it was a movement in which literally people occupied Wall Street. They occupied in front of the Bank of England. And that popular movement grew out of actually the revolutions in the Middle East. And the revolutionary movements in Spain as well. Those revolutionary movements in the Middle East and in Egypt and in Tunisia were in part fueled, large part, by the WikiLeaks publications, of State Department cables, which revealed how the US was backing the dictatorships, and the corruption in detail was revealed in these cables, and that led to popular movements who then managed to overthrow the dictatorships that were, of course, backed by the US. So WikiLeaks has been met with enormous attacks. Some of the first attacks, the most immediate after WikiLeaks started publishing the State Department cables, was a banking blockade. So PayPal, Bank of America, Visa, MasterCard cut off WikiLeaks from its donations. So all the donations, WikiLeaks is it's funded just by donations. And at the time of these publications about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and the Cablegate and Guantanamo Bay prison, WikiLeaks was receiving quite a lot of money through these PayPal and so on. And so overnight, practically, PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, and so on, they just shut off WikiLeaks from 97% of its revenue that came through those means. And how was it done? It was done completely extra legally. It was a phone call from a few senators in the US to these companies, and they just shut it off. And that actually led to WikiLeaks becoming an early adopters of Bitcoin. I think it's important to understand the attacks on WikiLeaks and the different aspects to those attacks. So the extraterritorial banking blockade, the political attacks, the legal attacks. Of course, Julian is under an extraordinary legal attack now. He's been charged under the Espionage Act. He's not accused of espionage, per se, but the legislation that they're using was introduced in 1917. It's incredibly broadly worded. And it says, the wording says, that if you receive information, possess information, and communicate information that the US deems is national defense information, then they can charge you under the Espionage Act. It's very vague. And he's charged under 17 counts of the Espionage Act, which each carry 10 years. If he's extradited to the United States from London, he faces a sentence of 175 years. He's fighting that in the courts, but he's fighting with both hands tied behind his back because they're not letting him out of prison. He's not serving a sentence. He's in the worst prison in Britain. They call it Britain's Guantanamo Bay. He's there with the worst possible offenders, and he's seen violent prisoners come and go, serve their sentences and be released. But Julian is just there indefinitely, it seems. What's being done to Julian is not a legitimate use of the legal system. It is bending the rules. It is corrupting the rules in order to keep him there. And in so doing, it is corrupting the whole system. It's not a legitimate legal process. And I think there's a lesson to be learned there about what, not just Julian, but anyone that challenges the hegemonic order with innovation is up against at that level. I know it sounds kind of depressing right now, but I don't want to depress you all, because in the fight that we've been engaged in over the past 12 years now, since WikiLeaks published these publications for which he's now facing 175 years. And those publications are about war, about civilian killings, about war crimes in Iraq, Afghanistan, about torture in Guantanamo Bay, about the gravest possible crimes that a state can engage in, and the subsequent cover-up of those crimes. So we've been fighting back. And we've been fighting back saying, well, the criminals here are actually the US personnel who killed 15,000 civilians in Iraq, who gunned down 2 Reuters journalists and 12 other civilians in the streets of Baghdad in a war crime that is documented in a very famous WikiLeaks video called Collateral Murder. But not just that. WikiLeaks hasn't just revealed past crimes committed by the US in those wars. It's also, through the fight back for Julian's freedom, we've been able to find out a lot more about the criminality that has been involved in getting Julian into prison. When Julian was first arrested on the 11th of April 2019, you may remember he had spent 7 years inside the Ecuadorian embassy, and he was kept in a legal limbo. He was not charged for the first 9 years, from 2010 to 2019. Yet, the UK said if he stepped out of that embassy, they would arrest him. And if you read the mainstream media and you believed them, you would think, oh, well, the US doesn't want him, he's just paranoid. But now everyone knows that's not true. When he stepped out of the embassy, he didn't step out, he was dragged out. Ecuador was basically sold him out for about $10 billion in loans. And he was dragged out of the embassy by British police. And the moment he was dragged out, the police revealed that the US wanted to extradite him. And that was a major shift in the narrative for many of the journalists who had believed their own propaganda. Because there had been an almighty propaganda war against Julian to pave the way and create the political environment in which it was acceptable to put Julian in prison. And that is something that was many years coming. And in the lead up to his arrest, it was relentless. The amount of propaganda and planting of stories in CNN, even in The Guardian, that published a front page entirely fabricated story that everyone knows is fabricated. Washington Post even wrote articles about how could The Guardian get this so wrong. And I'll tell you how. They basically lost all standards because Julian became a target. He was arrested, but then things started changing. At the moment of his arrest, 2 of the people who had been involved in an illegal operation against Julian inside the embassy became whistleblowers. They went to the press, they went to the Spanish police. They had been inside the embassy working as security guards, but what they had actually been doing was working for the CIA. They've been recording Julian's conversations with his lawyers. They had been instructed to steal the DNA from our baby's nappy. They had followed me, and they had even discussed plans to kidnap and poison Julian from the embassy. And they went to the police and they said, we've been engaged in this behavior and these operations, and we want to become whistleblowers. And from that, we now have evidence of the illegal activities that the United States was engaging in inside that embassy. There's a court case coming up, there a criminal action against the security firm that was recording Julian's legal conversations and engaging in all this illegality. When do you ever get to see this kind of rampant criminality committed by a state? Well, in this case, because we're fighting back. The very case against Julian is also of relevance to the Bitcoin community, because what the United States has done has bent the rules on sovereignty and jurisdiction. The Espionage Act is being applied to an Australian citizen in England. Julian has nothing to do with the United States other than publish evidence of wrongdoing by the United States. And the UK is going along with it. Imagine that. It's reaching into the jurisdiction of a foreign country and saying, well, because that information is ours, we're going to pluck this foreign national from the UK and place him in a US high security prison for 175 years. It's no coincidence that they've chosen Virginia, the Eastern District of Virginia, as the place to put Julian on trial for the Espionage Act. Why? Well, that's where all the big national security agencies and their contractors and so on are based. And the jury pool is what you might expect from the Eastern District of Virginia. Julian cannot mount a public interest defense under the Espionage Act. He cannot say, well, I published evidence of 15,000 civilians killed by the US military. I published evidence of this war crime which is captured in the collateral murder video. I published because it was in the public interest. I published and I won dozens of journalism prizes and human rights prizes because of these very publications. He cannot argue that. And that is why the extradition of Julian is a travesty of justice. Just a few months ago, there was an investigative piece published by 3 national security journalists in Washington, D.C. And these guys, no one can say that they're, Julian fans or anything like that. They're national security journalists based in D.C. And they wrote up an incredible investigation about what the CIA was up to under Mike Pompeo. And we had seen the kind of implementation, the operation of what they were up to through these Spanish whistleblowers and the material that has been seized through raids by the Spanish police and which is coming out in the court case in Spain. But this is the planning part of it. Over 30 sources, that's 30, over 30 sources, named and unnamed, from the CIA, from the National Security Council in the United States, spoke to these journalists because what was being planned was so outrageous and so out there that even within the administration, there was a rejection of it. And they said that Mike Pompeo was completely obsessed with WikiLeaks, and that he had asked for sketches and options about how to assassinate him. They had also discussed kidnapping him from the embassy, taking him to a black site, and it was in that context that the US finally brought a charge. Because they were planning this when they couldn't even think of how to charge him. Because they've charged him with the act of journalism, receiving information from a source, possessing information, and communicating it to the public. They've made that a crime. Obama had announced during his administration, and Obama, as you know, commuted Chelsea Manning's sentence. Chelsea Manning was the source of this material. Obama's Department of Justice, through its spokesperson, Matthew Miller, said, "This administration is not going to charge Julian Assange over the publications from Chelsea Manning." And the reason is this: Julian Assange is a publisher, he's not a hacker. And there is no way to go after Julian Assange which does not set a precedent for the rest of the press. And this administration is not prepared to do that. Well, the next administration was, and is, and did it precisely for that reason. So that is now where we stand. I always kind of tease Julian a bit because I say, you know, you're about 7 to 10 years ahead of your time. Back in 2012, he published a book called Cypherpunks, Freedom and the Future of the Internet. It was 2012, and he was getting reviews from places like The Guardian. And basically that lays out the surveillance architecture of the internet and how our freedom was about to be lost. He's famously said, "This is the last free generation." He said that a few years back. A few months later, Snowden revealed what he revealed. And what Julian had published 6 months prior was then exposed in detail. It's no coincidence that Bitcoin came of age around the same time that WikiLeaks did as well. And you might think, oh, well, this was a time of internet utopia and the internet was free back then, and, you know, people really felt there was a huge potential of freedom of exchange and cooperation and so on. And I think, in a way, that's true, but it's a bit of a naive understanding. I think those working on Bitcoin and Julian and some projects like that, but those are probably the two most impactful. They knew that we are living with borrowed time. They understood how things are going to converge and how the coercive capacities of states and of corporations to control information, control the architecture, is just a matter of time. And that's why we all have to fight back. Because Julian's freedom is connected not just to the future of Bitcoin and the potential of Bitcoin and so on, but it goes far deeper than that. Julian's freedom is connected to all our freedoms. So join our fight, because it's also your fight to free Julian. We need Julian. You need Julian because he also has an incredible foresight and ability to understand this big picture, which I think we all need. So I'm here. Julian's brother Gabriel is also here somewhere. There he is in the front row. And, you know, I have open DMs on Twitter. I'm very happy for people to come up and speak to me, talk about your ideas. Above all, please help us fight, because Julian can win this, and we all win if Julian is free. Thank you.
Welcome back to the Bitcoin Magazine Analyst Desk, brought to you by BitGo. We are live in Amsterdam at Bitcoin Amsterdam, and I'm joined by CK Snarks and George McHale. We just heard a very passionate conversation and speech from Stella Assange, detailing what has happened to her father and just how Bitcoin, or her husband, apologies, and how Bitcoin is the opportunity to pick up what essentially was stopped, this movement to push forward and just share information that is out in the open, speaking freely. We've seen this happen time and time again now over the last 3 years, where if you share an idea that someone in a position of power doesn't agree with, your head just gets chopped right off. And this conversation right now that we have the opportunity to have is not a conversation that every single viewer or every person around the world has the freedom and ability to do so. And so I count our great blessings to be able to be sitting here and talking about this stuff, because all over the world, it is not the same way. And there's one thing in particular I wanted to highlight, which she said, Bitcoin is the new Occupy Wall Street. And we saw the movement begin on the heels of the 2007 financial crisis. At the exact same time, Bitcoin was born. I'd love just unpacking that statement. George, first to you.
Yeah, I mean, what a speech. I mean, it was just so genuine and just hard to imagine where she's coming from, what she's been through. And I mean, heart goes out to Stella for coming out and bringing the story to Bitcoin Amsterdam. I thought it was fascinating to hear her talk about how Julian explained Bitcoin to her in detail all the way back in 2011, right? So if you're not familiar with Bitcoin history, I mean, this is such a fascinating part of what happened in the early days, right? Where WikiLeaks started accepting Bitcoin and drew a bunch of attention to it, probably a little bit before it was ready, right? And it kind of spooked Satoshi, if you read some of the writings. And so to kind of watch it all play out and see it come full circle and have her come here, just it's really like I feel like a historic moment, if that's not too much to say. But Bitcoin being the real Occupy Wall Street was such a great take, because this really is a protest if you think about it. But it's one, unlike Occupy Wall Street, it's one that has a practical solution. It's one that we actually have a tangible way to fight back. And that's what she encouraged us to do at the end. We have to fight back. We have to keep thinking about Julian and others like him who are confined for really no good reason. What did he do? He told the truth. He exposed the powers that be. That was it. And I mean, I'm going to be thinking about that talk for a while.
I know. Just to kind of follow up on that, firstly, as a husband, you know, I can't imagine my significant other being in that position, effectively legal limbo, where there is no real path to get out. There's no real charges. It's just locked down in some other jurisdiction with a different jurisdiction going after them, trying to bring them home, and all of it is happening outside of the law. And it really is absolutely just like stress-inducing just to think of her situation. But bringing it back to Bitcoin is about creating a foundation that cannot be censored, and that is why we need it, because without that, we can't have freedom, and we're already seeing that with PayPal and how all of this is escalating from WikiLeaks.
We all win if Julian is free. Those were her final words, and we will leave you with that. We will be back after this next panel, and be sure to like and subscribe down below.